You're watching Saturday Anime on the Sci-Fi Channel.
Greetings, this is Reverend Paul, and this is Raw. And once again, I am joined by a fan without a face again. Face, how are you doing?
I am very grateful to be returning to your YouTube channel, Reverend, and it's good to share some more thoughts, opinions, and discussions with you this fine, cold January day, night, whatever.
I'm glad to have you back, and today we are going to talk about the manga Life is Money. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because you contacted me and you told me that you thought Life is Money is better than Squid Game.
After I saw Squid Game, I definitely thought about this manga because I'm very familiar with the whole death game concept. I've seen it in a bunch of different anime and manga, but when I saw Squid Game, how it focused a lot more on the psychological aspect compared to some others which focus a lot more on the crazy death contests, and the psychological stuff is very basic, good, evil, all that jazz. I was reminded of this manga that I stumbled on way back when, just by accident, and I felt that it did a much better job, or at the very least had a more interesting hook and exploration of the whole psychological aspect compared to Squid Game.
Life is Money came out in August of 2011, and the story is by Teru Asanji, and the art is by Teka Yaguraba. So Life is Money predates Squid Game, and it is very similar, where it is a bunch of characters playing a game to the death to win a prize.
One thing that's important to note is that despite it being technically a death game, no one actually has to die in Life is Money. That's one of the first things that really sets it apart from Squid Game, because they make it very clear in Squid Game that dying is pretty much unavoidable, since it's essentially out of the player's hands in most of the games, especially the first two. Whereas in Life is Money, killing each other is basically ultimately up to the characters. They can quite literally go through the whole contest without ever killing anyone. So the basic premise of Life is Money centers around the main character, Meguru Furoku Koji, who is essentially a 20-something adult whose younger sister, Mawaru, is suffering from a heart condition that requires a heart transplant, and he needs a crud load of money to get it. But unfortunately, when he thought he had made it, with the help of a bunch of sponsors, they essentially tricked everybody. I think they were like politicians and everything, and stole all the money they raised. So then he's approached by this sketchy guy in a bar who suggests this game, which it's never given a definitive name. They call it Nightmare Game or Mental Prison, but the basic premise is you take 10 people, you stick them in this compound where if they can survive for 10 days without dying, each one of them gets 50 million yen. But the trick is that if, as we said, every time someone dies, the money is split up among the survivors, with it being a rule that if half of the people die, then the game ends right then and there, everyone gets the money and they go home. But see, here's the tricky part. No physical violence of any kind is allowed, and they have cameras throughout the whole compound to make sure that that rule is enforced. So that means you can't do anything to them. Even something as simple as pulling on hair or shoving somebody is prohibited. The second one, and this is the more devious one, each one of them has to wear a special bracelet around their wrist that measures their heart rate, sweat, and all that stuff. And if their anxiety and their stress goes above a certain level, like their heart rate reaches above a certain level, then the bracelet will kill them in what's known as mental down or mental over. So that's the basic idea. You have 10 people trapped in a room where they can't physically kill each other, but if they so choose, they can use psychological warfare and other tricks in order to kill each other.
Yes, and that's very similar to Squid Game, which tells the story of Gi-hun, who's a down-on-his-luck schlubby dude who has to get money for his mother's operation, and he needs money for his estranged daughter, and then he enters into the Squid Game, where they have to do a series of children's games to ultimately win their prize. Just off the bat, I'm wondering if the creators of Squid Game read this manga, because there are a lot of parallels, especially in the setup.
There are definitely some similarities, but there are a couple of differences, like obviously the no violence thing, but the other one is in the penalty system that Life is Money introduces. Each day, the characters have to roll a 6-sided dice, where depending on how it rolls, they lose one of their 5 senses. They get a bandana put over their eyes or over their mouth for their sense of touch and sight, nose plugs for their sense of smell, and a special anesthetic that paralyzes their whole body for touch. And then there's a 6th side where if you roll that, then not only do you not get a penalty, but any previous penalties are canceled out. That's also the point. It's to add more stress to the characters because it's possible for them to lose all 5 senses, at which point they basically would go almost assuredly insane from the sensory deprivation.
The whole idea of rolling the dice and every day they lose another sense, I think is a really interesting idea. Ishimakura is the first character to die in Life is Money. And as you said, in Life is Money, violence is prohibited. The way Ishimakura is killed is essentially by the other players bullying him and him stressing out to the point where he's killed by the bracelet that's on his wrist.
Yeah, that's one of the things how we're introduced to, I guess you could call him the main antagonist, Aoshi Aoyori, who is, at least according to himself, a psychiatrist, which means that he is obviously an expert in different forms of psychological warfare, and thus he knows, or at least can pick up on people's individual weaknesses. In the case of Ishimakura, he was bullied as a kid due to him being, well, as you can see from his character design, is not exactly conventionally attractive and was bullied pretty much every day of his life. So being bullied now and having no way to fight back or even get out of the room because they essentially trapped him in there until he would give it up. They essentially bully him and even chant die multiple times, though part of that might be because they just assume that he's not actually going to die and that the contest is just a joke in that respect. They effectively push his buttons until he breaks, which is part of what makes it such a dark kind of story, because the manga goes out of its way to use the art to convey the psychological trauma that he's going through, using very surrealist, abstract artwork that shows the characters stretching and contorting and their eyes bulging to massive proportions that it leaves you genuinely unsettled when you see it.
Yeah, I think it's probably the strongest aspect of the manga. I like the way, as the characters are more stressed out and they're having more psychosis, reality starts to bend and it becomes almost like a Salvador Dali painting. And it even reminds me too of like those scary storybooks I used to read as a kid. Very kind of gruesome, disturbing faces and things like that. And even just the regular manga style, their face and expressions will twist.
The manga really does use the art to great effect because it even does that with like some of the sensory deprivation. Mostly when they have a bandana put over the character's eyes, there'll actually be panels where everything is black, or they'll show the character, everything around him is jet black, and it's only him that's visible and maybe like another character that he's holding on to, which kind of helps sell the whole sensory deprivation thing. And sometimes it can also lead to some pretty good artwork, like one of the other characters, Fuyumi. Fuyumi loses her senses, and there's actually a panel showing just the head separated from the body to properly convey the sensation that they're experiencing after being injected with the nerve agent.
The character Utsurumiya, she is a trans woman, and she is participating in the game as a way to get money for her gender reassignment surgery. And she is also the focal point of what I think is probably one of the most disturbing scenes in the manga, where, once again, just like that fat dude who they bullied into his brain frying and him keeling over, within the contestants, there is a killer. And this killer targets Utsurumiya, and then he cuts off her hair, he does all these things to kind of get in her mind and psychologically torture her, and eventually she ends up stressing out too, and she ends up dying.
Yeah, he knows what to target. In her case, it's the fact that she hates the fact that she has the body of a guy, and he actually basically forces her in front of a mirror to look at herself while cutting off her long hair and everything to make her look as masculine as humanly possible, while also destroying her doll, Chappie, which we learn through flashbacks is named after a dog, which was like something out of Elfenlied, was the only thing that showed her any kind of love or affection. But her bullies, they literally kill this dog and shove it into her backpack, which they also paint red with its blood because we're told that she always wanted a red backpack.
I did not like Life is Money as much as you did. I actually think it's an interesting concept. I like the art style and I like the characters, but I feel like it's a story that just loses interest in itself and it just wraps everything up. And one thing that I will say about Squid Game is the fact that it's a story about desperation. And it's about these people who are, some of them are good, some of them are bad, but they're all being pushed to this point to doing these fucked up things. But the thing I really didn't care for in Life is Money is the fact that we're going to throw a serial killer in here. We're going to throw a sadistic character in here. And it's like, okay, they try to give them a backstory where we learn with the killer character, they had a troubled childhood and that's why they're like that. But it doesn't feel earned. It just feels like we created a killer, we're going to throw them in the story, but we don't see that de-evolution of somebody who was was an okay person and now they're the most fucked up person. I think that's what Squid Game does better than Life is Money.
I feel like I kind of disagree on that respect. So we know in Life is Money, the two main bad guys, at least one of them is the gangster guy whose name I can't remember, who is just a dickhead from right out of the starting gate. You know he's bad, and he's almost comically bad. And then you have the main character's former best friend, who we know he entered Squid Game because he essentially stole money from his company and basically has debt collectors breathing down his neck. Now, in Life is Money, the main bad guys, there's three of them. There's Ayoshi, the psychiatrist, though he kind of flip-flops between being the main bad guy and just more of an annoyance. Then there is Romero Shirkagawa, who we learn is a sociopath who entered the game not for money, simply because he could torture people, because according to his backstory, he suffered from a lot of domestic abuse, and torturing others was basically his way of kind of retaliating. But I guess if you wanted to go for like a main character who's the bad guy, that would be Akira Nico, who we learn in his backstory grew up in a broken home, and he tried to make something of himself through artwork, but due to hereditary illnesses, he had a weak body and thus he couldn't pursue it properly, and he gradually fell into despair even when he tried to enter Buddhism to try and find some relief, and the only thing that ended up doing was causing him to feel as though all life is despair. He essentially became a nihilist almost. I kind of feel like that makes the characters a little more interesting, because it'd be simple enough just to make them bad guys for the sake of it, but they're different kinds of bad. You would figure with a game like this, which we don't know how long it's been going on for, that's actually something that's kind of weird about the game. We barely know anything about it or how long it's been going on for, but apparently it's well known enough to where some characters actively seek it out. That's the thing. In death games, there's always at least one character who knows or at least has an idea of what the game's all about and enters it because it basically gives them a way to legally kill somebody and make some money off of it. So it's not that crazy to believe there wouldn't at least be one sadistic psycho out of the 10 people that are in there.
Yeah, what I would say with Squid Game with Song-woo, he doesn't start off as cartoonishly evil. We see him give money to that guy Ali, and he's friendly with Gi-hun, and he may be like a calculated businessman who's fucking people over with their money, but we watch him go from a crooked businessman to just a complete psychopath, and he has this arc. I think the problem with this manga is that it's only 15 chapters, and it just spends the first 10 chapters developing the story, and then by the time we get to like chapter 11, it's like, okay, enough of this. We gotta end this stuff. If it kept going and it was able to give us more scenes with the Nico character, and if it was able to integrate his backstory into the story organically, because right now it's like Nico has a face-off with Meguru, and then Meguru is basically just pushing him to the point where he's gonna have a nervous breakdown. Then we get the backstory, then he's dead. So it feels very rushed to me.
I feel like the problem with that is Squid Game has the advantage of being a show where every episode is almost an hour long. Not to mention, it has more time to develop the characters, and it also has more dynamic action. We have physical contests and we have psychological ones, but the problem is with a manga, there is less things you could do with that, especially because, as we said, violence is not allowed at all in the game. That's a key point. Psychological warfare is the main thing, and I imagine the manga writers probably were worried if they made the manga too long, they'd lose people, because it is very difficult to make psychological warfare interesting for an extended period of time, because even with how disturbing the art can be, especially near the end, that sort of thing only works for so long before people just become numb to it. I imagine with Elfen Lied, which is infamous for how violent and graphic it can be, I imagine with how long, I think it was like a couple hundred chapters, by the end, people were just completely numb to all the limbs getting sent flying in every direction and body parts getting ripped to shreds. It would be the same thing with the psychological stuff.
I think you actually have more freedom in manga than you do in live action, but I'll agree that the story of Squid Game had more room to breathe over the course of 9 episodes. This may be 15 chapters, but it feels very condensed. And I wish this was like 40 or 50 chapters and we could really see all these characters and their interactions, because you mentioned about the violence. 5 characters die, we only see 2 deaths. All the other deaths happen off screen and somebody tells us about them.
Well, to be fair, with 2 of them, that also plays into the psychological aspect. They use the fact that the deaths are a surprise to shock not just the audience, but the other characters, hoping that it'll unsettle them enough or at least shake them up enough to where they'll be easier to send into shock and kill them completely. But you're not wrong. There's at least 2 characters. There's Daisuke, who's like this tough guy looking character who basically does does nothing throughout the series despite being the most level-headed guy in the room. And then there's this other guy, Yosuke Makaba, who's this old-looking guy who turns out is just some random hobo they dragged off the street. Throughout most of the chapters, he acts like he's smarter than he actually is, and you maybe think there's more to him, but when we finally get to the last chapter, it's revealed, nope, he's just some hobo.
The scene with Utsunomiya is the first time we see the killer in the manga, but Utsunomiya is not the first victim. The first victim is the fashion girl. I can't remember her name.
It's a Miko Nekomachi.
If we would have just had a tease of the killer during her death, we don't have to see the whole death. We could just see her, see him, and then we cut away. At least we have a tease to the killer, and it's building the mystery versus they essentially reveal the killer in that murder sequence, and then in the following sequence, they reveal the identity of the killer. There was no time to even let that mystery play out.
Well, part of the reason for that is because technically the killer only kills one person directly, and that was Utsunomiya, who he actually acted upon. We learn later near the end that Miko Nekomachi, she was a model. We learned that she was purging herself with her, vomiting and all that junk in the toilet, and that ended up being what triggered her bracelet to kill her, and what the guy did instead was essentially mutilate her corpse for psychological reasons, which I would argue that's more disturbing, the fact that he went the extra mile to do that to someone who was already dead, taking advantage of the fact that the violence rule only applies to people who are alive. Once they're dead, you can basically do whatever the hell you want to them, and what Nico does to her body is pretty horrifying.
I just wish they would have introduced the idea of the killer a little bit earlier, but there's even a part of me that just feels like it would be better if there was no killer at all. One of the other things I think Squid Game does better is create this sense of stress, where like when you're watching Squid Game, it's a very stressful show because you're feeling the stress that these characters are under because they have a literal gun to their head. Whereas with Life is Money, I don't get a sense of stress. It's just a bunch of characters saying, well, we got to start bullying these people into killing each other, otherwise we're not going to get enough money. There's no impending sense of doom.
I'd argue that's not the case. See, Squid Game mostly focuses on greed and how it can corrupt people. Every person who's in the game in one way or another is there because of money that they need, usually because they screwed themselves in one way or another, like the main character, how the main reason he's in the game is because he is in debt because he's a compulsive gambler, and his friend, he stole a ton of money from his company. The only person in that who was essentially forced into her situation was the North Korean defector who needs money to essentially bring the rest of her family over. She's doing it for altruistic reasons, but the main point is what people are willing to do for money. Are they willing to go through with this whole thing, especially since at one point they're actually given the option to leave the game completely if they so choose, but they come back voluntarily. But in Life is Money, it deals a lot more with the issue of psychology. In Squid Game, once they're there, they basically have no choice but to compete because, like you said, they have a gun to their head. But the same thing is technically true in Life is Money, since once they're there, they can't just leave whenever they feel like it. But the trick is, in Squid Game, dying is literally unavoidable. In Red Light, Green Light, and the Cutting Out game, it doesn't matter what they do. If they don't play, they get shot, and if they fail, they get shot. The only time where killing each other really becomes a thing is during the other three games with Tug of War, the Glass Breaking, and finally the Squid Game itself. So dying basically isn't really something they can avoid, especially since if they don't play, they'll die anyway. But in Life is Money, it boils down to choice, human nature. It explores how far some people are willing to go, whether it's just for money or simply to save their own necks, because that's part of the reason for the whole rule of if 5 people die, the game ends there. It's not just about money, it's about ending it at that point in time. So that's part of what also makes it scary, in my opinion. It's exploring how far and what people are willing to do to get what they want, or how selfish they can be, but they don't need to use violence to do it.
Aside from all the economic critiques that you could say Squid Game is making, I feel like Squid Game is a story about desperation. It's about the things desperate people are forced to do or feel like they're forced to do. And I feel like Life is Money is a story about community. It's almost like a story about how people can come together and work together towards a common goal, but people don't, and they turn on each other for their own selfish reasons. My problem with the story, because I think it's a great concept, and I think the story starts off fine, the problem is that like we don't get to that place in a satisfactory way. Like with the fat dude, who's the first guy who gets killed, when we first meet the character, he's a cool guy, and he's willing to cooperate, and he's with Maguru, and he's willing to help everybody so everybody could win. And then literally the next scene, now he's an evil son of a bitch who's going to steal everybody's money. If we would have had time to see this guy guy transform from one side to the other, we could see that arc. That would have been so much better. But, I don't know if it's deadlines or the author lost interest in the story, but there's not enough room there.
I think I might know what he was going for. I think the main theme of the whole story is the concept of whether or not life is worth living to an extent. Not desperation, but I'm trying to think of the right way to say it. I think depression, or simply having the will to live in spite of going through so much.